The domain of politics is a realm of unthinkable things, things that seem impossible to believe, things you don't want to accept to be true, norms that in your heart, especially as a child or as a teenager, you rebel against. You can't accept that this is normal. You can't accept that this is human nature. You can't accept that this is business as usual. Can you imagine living through a period of history in which the communist government of Beijing, China, is in a military alliance with the Muslim religious fundamentalists of Iran? It's unthinkable. It's impossible to believe. Simultaneously and concurrently, the communist government of Beijing, China, is trying to suppress, if not eradicate, the Muslim faith within their own territory, notably, most controversially, in Xinjiang, through the use of coercive re-education camps. What a contradiction. Impossible, unthinkable. You can't imagine it. You can't accept it. Imagine if you were living through a period of history in which the United States government was both publicly and privately committed to anti-communism, to opposing communism all over the world. And yet, nevertheless, they were in a strategic alliance with the government of communist China to support Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. That happened during my lifetime. Depending on how young you are watching this video, it happened during your lifetime as well. If you have memories of Bill Clinton, it happened during your lifetime as well, right? Wasn't just under Nixon, wasn't just under Ronald Reagan, continued right through to the Bill Clinton era. And coincidentally, these things are all tied together. You might have a memory of Bill Clinton going to China and posing for photographs on the Great Wall of China, and Bill Clinton being the first president in the history of the United States to admit or concede that Tibet would henceforth always be a Chinese territory. Since World War II, the United States had never accepted that before. It's a significant strategic domino, so to speak. And that, in fact, during presidency of Bill Clinton, strangely, there was a new sort of economic partnership between the United States of America and China blossoming. And what do you know? It was a brotherhood, born of bloodshed, that they had fought together on the same side in a series of unpopular wars that nobody wants to imagine, that nobody wants to remember, I should say, that included Cambodia. When I have discussed that particular chapter of history, both with specialists and non-specialists, and when I say specialists, I mean people who have a PhD and are professors teaching the history and politics of Cambodia, or teaching something like anthropology of Southeast Asia, including Cambodia, who lecture on, consider themselves experts. When I have discussed this with both experts, including some people who devoted their lives to researching and writing books about the history and politics, and non-specialists, the number one most common response and reply I get is, that can't possibly be true. It can't be. They can't accept it. They can't believe it. I have never once had someone respond by pointing the finger at me and saying that I don't know what I'm talking about, attacking my character, attacking my credibility. Every single time, whether in some cases these were people with gray hair, these were elderly university professors, some of these ordinary people, the response is, That's so immoral that I don't want to believe it could be true. And the only reason they're bothering to say this is that, of course, the way in which I've presented these facts to them is some part of their rational mind is aware this probably is true. There is a hackneyed phrase that we're all infinitely ignorant. I really don't like that phrase. It frankly has a certain sense of resignationism about it. I don't think you should be comfortable with your own ignorance. I don't think you should be resigned to your own ignorance. A few months ago now, I was taking a walk with Melissa, and we were talking about Israel and U.S. foreign policy and the war in Gaza. And the question of China's current role in the conflict came up with comparative reference back to what China's position was in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, basically through the latter half of the 20th century. And I had the honesty and self-discipline to say, look, I really don't know. Now, I have very sharp memory. I know what it is I do know. I know what it is I don't know. And I said, well, the most shocking thing of all is there was a particular course I took with a particular professor. And even though he found the time in that course in the history of basically 20th century Chinese politics, he took the time to delve into China's foreign policy in Africa in great detail. We got into China, Africa. Now that I think about it, Israel was not mentioned even once. Now, because of some research I did, and actually these papers are still on the internet now, I have done research about left-wing extremists in Japan, basically Japanese communists and far, far left-wingers, who were involved with pro-Palestinian terrorism. Fascinating chapters of the world history, and showed the way these things. That had drawn my attention to, oh yeah, wasn't there something about the Chinese and other communists providing training camps? But I was really just speculating based on little bits of piece of information. We had this walk down to the ocean and back. I came home, and just Wikipedia. Really, I did look into and read some other articles beyond Wikipedia, but already at the first step reading Wikipedia, here's a whole chapter of history that's incredibly important. It's mind-blowingly important. It's very much related to politics that are unfolding today. And what do you know? Even back during the life of Mao Zedong, during China's most extreme period of not just communism in general, but of hostility to religion in specific, hostility towards Islam in specific, paradoxically, while China was trying to build this atheist utopia at home, it's a much different period, Mao Zedong's China versus Xi Jinping's China, during a time when they also didn't believe in, private property and money and the family and all kinds of things they were trying to abolish and change the world while they're on their own, utopian/dystopian course. They had a completely cynical strategic partnership with the worst Muslim terrorists ever known in the history of the world. And they were very much in bed with, the equivalent of ISIS in their day, the equivalent of Hamas and Hezbollah. And they were arming and training Palestinian terrorists to fight against Israel. So again, I actually had done research about the connection between Japanese communists, and Palestinian terrorists. But nevertheless, here I am as an old man, about 45 years old when this happened. And my mind is blown. And I'm aware the reason why I'm only learning about this now. I mean, I've read many, many textbooks and many, many essays, and I've attended many, many academic lectures about exactly this period of Chinese politics. This was omitted. This was suppressed. And it is no doubt because most of the authors of these books and most of the professors giving the lectures, they are to some extent pro-communist. They are to some extent pro-China. And they are deeply embarrassed dealing with the implications of what Mao Zedong's policy was. And more broadly in the communist period, he wasn't always in control. And if you keep going, after a certain point, he's dead. But, that throughout the whole communist period, you have to deal with this Unbelievable. Impossible to justify, impossible to reason through, impossible to make sense of cynical alliance between this extremist, atheistic communist government and Muslim radicals, really throughout the whole Middle East, not just in Israel, Palestine. Okay. And guess what? It still matters today. Guess what? The extreme cynicism of the Chinese communists that was evident in their alliance with Palestinian terrorists during the life of Mao Zedong, you can say there is a kind of continuity from those years to the present arrangement between Xi Jinping and the Muslim regime in Iran. Okay? What is normal in politics? What would not shock you? What would you find easy to believe? Okay. The measure of your own sophistication in politics is precisely the extent to which, rather than being shocked, rather than being astonished, you feel like, oh, yeah, the parts fit. Oh, yeah, what you've just told me is like a missing puzzle piece that snaps into place with other particular chapters and episodes of history that I've known, other factoids you're familiar with from that period. But also, and most fundamentally, that fits with what I know about human nature. That fits with what I understand very fundamentally politics to be. I dislike the government of Thailand. The government of Thailand is a democracy. I am rather biased against it. I think it's a bad system of government. If the communist government of China suddenly invaded Thailand and declared that there were going to be no more elections, there's going to be no more freedom of speech, no freedom for the newspapers to criticize the government at all of that was going to be swept away, and Thailand was going to join the workers' paradise. They were going to be subordinated to a communist dictatorship. All of a sudden, I would be highly motivated to fight for the future of the democracy in Thailand, even if what I were fighting for is merely the restoration of a system of democracy that I consider despicable. And that's normal. That's what political science is. Put into practice, that's what political philosophy means. And that's what being an adult, a grown-up, a human being on planet Earth means. I once heard a lecture from a left-wing university professor, left-of-center university professor, not communist, but left. And he said, look, decades ago, he'd wake up in the morning criticizing Margaret Thatcher. He'd eat lunch criticizing Margaret Thatcher. He'd meet his friends to drink beer, and they'd criticize Margaret Thatcher. And he'd go to sleep at night, criticizing Margaret Thatcher. It's very believable. I was a child, but I can remember there was a period of this intense, condemnation of the leadership of Margaret Thatcher, of the Conservative Party. A lot of people in the center, a lot of moderates. So that, of course, people on the left, even more so. Ultimately, people on the right wanted to get rid of her too, and that was the end of her political career. That's the story. He said, okay, this was his life. The rhythm of his life was the hatred and condemnation of Margaret Thatcher. He said, but if England had been invaded by Germany at that time, all of a sudden he would have rallied around the leadership of Margaret Thatcher and would have suddenly been willing to fight and die for the future of this regime that he considers deplorable, right? Now, it struck me as a peculiar choice of example, because during that period of time, what do you mean Germany? Obviously, the real hypothetical question would be Russia, What if Russia had invaded England? That's probably the better question to ask, but maybe because he was so left-wing, maybe he didn't want to use Russia as an example. He wanted to use Germany. Guys, when the war in Ukraine started, I seriously considered joining the army to fight for the future of this terrible regime in Ukraine. I decided against it. But if I wanted to do it, nobody could have stopped me. My girlfriend couldn't have stopped me. My mom couldn't have stopped me. You in my audience couldn't have stopped me. I really considered it the basis of a variety of facts. Before this war with Vladimir Putin started, Ukraine did not have a working and legitimate system of democracy, not at all. We could ask a question sincerely prior to the war between Russia and Ukraine, the current and ongoing war. Who had a more legitimate system of democracy, Thailand or Ukraine? I'll leave this as a numbers question. They're both bad. Okay, all of a sudden, you are faced with the reality of Ukraine being conquered by Vladimir Putin's Russia. You have to make a choice. I had to make a choice. Which side are you on? And obviously, millions of people, millions, are now willing to fight for the future of democracy in Ukraine, not the past, right? The prospect that Ukraine could be, should be some kind of legitimate democracy, even if it wasn't, or even if the first legitimate election in Ukraine in the entire history of the country took place 5 minutes before the outbreak of the current war with the election of Zelensky, who's still in power now. Does anyone know the schedule for when the next elections in Ukraine are going to be? Do you think there's going to be a whole lot of freedom of speech? Do you think the pro-Russian candidates are going to... How much democracy there is in Ukraine today, and how much there is in Vladimir Putin's Russia, and so on? Questions worth asking, and for another video. There is a leader in the movement called Joey Carbstrong, and how he became a leader, why he is a leader, who follows him, and who pays him to be a leader. These are questions that have answers, and the answers are bad. The answers are a lamentable, dark depiction of human nature in general, and of the vegan movement in particular. And this guy, Joey Carbstrong, he has actually been to Israel several times. He has been invited there. He's been on tour there. He's given lectures there. And it would be interesting to know who paid for him to go there. I think Joey Carbstrong has received support from vegan groups and atheist groups and political groups in Israel that I have never received, and that you, whoever you are in the audience, that you have never received. So actually, for several years, he danced a merry jig with donors and sponsors and colleagues and collaborators in Israel, which is in some ways not surprising, because Israel has a very high percentage of vegans. It's the homeland of many of the world's most ardent and strident vegan activists. It's where a lot of the action is for the vegan movement. But of course, in some ways, it is surprising. Joey Carbstrong is not Jewish, and he is not a Zionist, and his anti-Zionism has now become impossible to ignore. And so I would say to all those vegans in Israel, you chose to dance with the wrong whore. Joey Carbstrong, did he do something wrong in choosing to take a public position on the war between Gaza and Israel, the current unfolding struggle? In my opinion, no. In my opinion, part of learning is making mistakes. Part of learning is standing up and explaining to others what it is you understand and how it is you've come to the conclusions you've come to in life. One of the advantages of democracy, even the most corrupt forms of democracy, is just forcing people to stand in front of a live audience and explain in their own words why they've come to the conclusions they've come to, what the research was, what the process was, to explain the reasoning for the course of action they want others to take. And, you can really be living in a quite dictatorial, undemocratic regime, but that nevertheless has that quality of cross-examination, of the presentation of contrasting views, of people reasoning things through, of people having to make a case for what it is they believe and why. So, when I first came on the internet, there was much more freedom of speech than there is now. There was much less censorship than there is now, East and West all around the world. And I thought, when I looked at even examples of really right-wing nutcases like à-bas-le-ciel, who is also vegan, look at someone like that and think, well, isn't it kind of powerful and meaningful that you're capturing what this woman believes at this stage of her life? I forget how young. I forget if she was 21 or what, but she was a very young woman. I forget if she was 19 or 21 or what, but she was, as I recall, in her early 20s. Okay, you're capturing this, you're immortalizing this, and then years from now, we're going to get to see how her views crack and change, how her beliefs fall apart, what the new direction takes on. You get to see how her followers are disillusioned. It's like, wow, here we are in a new era of freedom of speech where, whatever it was you believed at any one point in time is really immortalized in it. It's written in pen. It's not written in pencil. And there is no eraser. Well, how wrong I was. In case you don't know the story with à-bas-le-ciel, a comedian, a comedy channel, drew attention to her by making fun of her. And as soon as thus her videos went viral, as people say, she's already huge numbers of views and huge amount of supports. Her YouTube channel was erased, and it really set a precedent. At that time, there was no clear direction from YouTube or what was and was not allowed in terms of freedom of speech. And this really inaugurated the new era of censorship of political views on YouTube. So look, I am actually not saying, obviously, I'm not saying I agree with what her political views were. And I am not actually even saying I would defend her right to state those views. That's a sort of common, corny thing to say. I'm actually making a much more simple point here that learning and growing up, it involves taking risks. It involves making a statement about what you think is right and wrong, what you think is true and false, and then later, looking back on it and realizing how ignorant you were. So for someone like Joey Carbstrong, I really don't feel that I want to deprive him of that process. I think there's actually something precious and profound in his being wrong. And anyone in the audience who is an intellectual can very easily and casually see the ways in which he's wrong, can see what's wrong with his reasoning. So we all get to learn from the mistakes he's making, and he gets to learn from the mistakes he's making himself. If you are someone who, before this period of terrorism began, I'm sorry, was it January? What's October the 6th? October the 7th, something like this. Let's get the date. October, we lived through it. Okay, October 7th. There you go. I had January 6th on the mind for some reason. There were a lot of people in Israel who, before October 7th, 2023, they woke up and they criticized Benjamin Netanyahu with their breakfast. They met with friends and criticized Benjamin Netanyahu over lunch, and they condemned and mocked and made fun of Benjamin Netanyahu and his government when drinking beer and over dinner. This was very much part of the rhythm of life in Israel at that time. Okay? Now, for my part, I really am an atheist. I really am a nihilist. I very much criticize and condemn Israel from that perspective. I'm very staunchly opposed to Islam. I'm anti-Islamic, but I'm also, in as much as Israel is a kind of theocracy, I'm also opposed to Israel. I would go far beyond mere separation of church and state. I actually want an atheistic or even nihilistic state that's very openly opposed to religion. So on that issue, I'm an extremist. I'm not a moderate when it comes to separation of church and state. So there are all kinds of things I would, so to speak, wake up and criticize Israel for, and so on. And then suddenly you are in the position of contrasting Benjamin Netanyahu to the terrorist leaders of Hamas, and on his other border, the terrorist leaders of Hezbollah. And it is very much like the allegory I gave you before. No matter how bitterly you may be opposed to the current government of Thailand, no matter how harshly you may criticize them, now all of a sudden you're faced with the enormity of a threat of a far more immoral enemy. Okay. What if Benjamin Netanyahu had not negotiated the release of the hostages? What if he had pressed a button and simply dropped an atom bomb on Gaza City? What if Benjamin Netanyahu said, "We are not running out of atom bombs. If you do not return the hostages tonight, I'm going to press the button again, and there will be another atom bomb. You can flee for your lives if you want to. You have so many hundred of our citizens as hostages. So many thousand of our civilians have died. Some were raped, some were tortured, some were burned alive. Rape is of tremendous historical significance in this, frankly. It really is. Okay. You know what? We're not going to fight a ground war. We are not going to fight house to house. We're not going to fight tunnel to tunnel. We are just going to keep dropping atom bombs until you've returned all the hostages." At the end of World War II, do you know why the United States dropped an atom bomb on Japan? Because the Americans did not want to fight a protracted ground war. They did not want to fight house to house, street to street. And somebody else did. Joseph Stalin did. The Russians were very happy to fight street by street, house by house, from north to south across Japan. And at that very time, at that very moment when the Americans dropped the atom bomb, forcing the Japanese to capitulate and surrender to the Americans, not to the Russians, the Americans were struggling to forestall the Russification of all of Japan, which is exactly what happened to Sakhalin Island. Sakhalin Island is an enormous island with enormous oil wealth that is still part of Vladimir Putin's Russia to this day because it was conquered by the Communist Army in the final days, weeks, months of World War II. I will leave it up to you to reflect on how different this is than all of the bullshit you have heard in your high school history classes and from left-wing news media that is perpetually wringing its hands about what a terrible atrocity the American use of the atom bomb was and how needless it was. Melissa and I have even seen documentary films that say this way. And for some reason, they just neglect to mention that, in fact, America was in a competition with Russia to see who would conquer Japan. And if the Russians had conquered more of Japan, they would have kept all that they conquered. And they did. It's not hypothetical. So we can now look back and ask two very different questions. What if America had not used the atom bomb in Japan at all? Russia continued to conquer Japan island by island. We could have ended up with a North Korea versus South Korea situation. North Japan versus South Japan, right? Could have ended up happening. Could be that the whole of Japan became part of the Soviet communist bloc. That's one alternate history. Can ask a different question. What if the American army had never been deployed to Myanmar? What if they had never been deployed to Tibet? What if they had never been deployed to Kunming? What if they had never bothered fighting naval battles in Samoa and Thailand? I mean, it's great. World War II was truly a world war. What if the Americans had just not had any Asian theater of operations, Pacific theater of operations, Japanese theater? What if the Americans had just used the atom bomb on Japan? And you tell me, you come with an estimate of how many people didn't have to die everywhere else, including even, smaller islands like Iwo Jima. What if America had simply bombed the heart out of the Japanese Empire? What if they had just started dropping atom bombs? You could say a couple years earlier. Frankly, you could even measure out the number of months earlier and said, look, either you are going to evacuate all Japanese troops from Myanmar, or the bomb falls on Tokyo next. Either you're going to evacuate all Japanese troops from long list of conquests, all of mainland China, so on and so forth, all of Korea. Either you are going to give up your empire and return to Japan and surrender and so on, or guess what? We're not running out of atom bombs. The position we are in today in evaluating the violence used by the Israeli government, okay? They did make the decision to fight house by house, street by street, apartment block by apartment block, hospital by hospital, all right? And the results, while gruesome, are no more gruesome than the army of Napoleon fighting in Spain. They are no more gruesome than World War I, World War II, conventional combat in any other era. And we all know that dropping the atom bomb would indeed be gruesome in a very different way. But not a single Israeli soldier would die, right? You wouldn't be risking the lives of your own people, right? Same thing with America dropping nukes on Japan and not deploying the Army and the Navy over a huge part of the world's surface. If on that very day, let's say as the clock approached midnight on October 7th, 2023, Benjamin Netanyahu had simply retaliated by dropping an atom bomb, the whole history of the world now would be different. And we can ask whether the body count would have been greater or lower in the end. There is a theory, however horrifying, that the atom bomb would have so terrified Hamas in Gaza that they would have capitulated, they would have surrendered, just as the Japanese did. They would have said, this is a price too high to pay. And there's an argument that no, Hamas is so fanatical, they would have only redoubled their strength and fought even more, and fought to the last bitter mile as their own homeland became irradiated beyond recognition, as men, women, and children died of radiation burns in their apartments and in terrible agony. Apparently, we will never know, unless this is what's coming next. But you can see now, in retrospect, exactly what the disadvantages were of the choice that was made by Netanyahu. Okay. We live in a world where people are so unfamiliar with the fundamentals of political science, with the questions of what political philosophy means when it is put into practice. Okay, that people like Joey Carbstrong, they really do represent the majority. They represent people who are at such a low level of political sophistication, such a low level of formal and informal education, that they can't understand these things, and they can't accept them, and they won't. In the same way that so many people, whether they were non-specialists or old professors with gray beards, when I told them, look, this is the reality of American politics in the 20th century. You think America's anti-communist? Guess what? In Cambodia, they were pro-communist. In their alliance with Mao Zedong in China, they were pro-communist. You think China is Islamophobic, is anti-Islam, is pro-atheism. Guess what? when it suited one man. One man made a decision for an alliance, just like a kingdom in the Dark Ages, just like the tales of, emperors in ancient Rome. Okay? Paradoxically enough, China could support not just Islam in general, but Palestinian terrorists in specific. And we are dealing with the legacy, the knock-on consequences of that today. Okay? In the same sense of disbelief, right? Someone like Joey Carbstrong, in examining what's happening in Gaza today, is looking at the bare facts and can't accept them and can't believe that this is real and can't believe that this is, shall we say, the inhumanity of man to man. Okay? And that is why my philosophy is called nihilism. Because I do not want to oppose one set of ideals to another. I want to invite you to really make progress as an individual and realize the extent to which there is nothing to be believed in. There's a better future for humanity. And we are going to get there working with human nature, not against it. We are going to become better people by recognizing first and foremost that we are people only, neither angels nor demons.